Welcome back to Davenant Academy and our class, Introduction to the Reformation. Today we'll be talking about the English Reformation, or at least the early stages of it. Now, the English Reformation, I imagine, is of particular interest to you. Why? Well, because if you're watching this video, you are presumably an English speaker, and probably you come from a church background that has been shaped by the English Reformation more than anything else. If you are an Anglican, if you are a Presbyterian, or if you are a Baptist, at the very least, you come from a tradition that emerges from the English Reformation. Now, the English Reformation is quite, I wouldn't say unique, but it's very different than what we see in Germany and in Switzerland, what we've seen so far, because the English Reformation does not start from the bottom up. It starts from the top down. We have the King of England himself, Henry VIII, is the initiator of this Reformation. And the King of England is not particularly interested in doctrine of justification by faith. He's not interested in the things that animated Martin Luther. He has more political motives in mind. Now, that said, this has often been overemphasized. You can't say, as some have said, that the English Reformation was political, not theological, because the politics and the theology were deeply intertwined. The King of England wants to reject the authority of the Pope because he sees the Pope as meddling as a foreign political power in the affairs of England. But the Pope's political claims were based on the Pope's theological claims. The Pope claims, by virtue of being head of the church, to have all of these political powers as well. So the politics and the theology are really inseparable at many points. Also, it can be overemphasized how much this is a top-down thing. Henry is the driving force, but he really only succeeds because there's a widespread feeling in England that the church has become corrupt and is abusing its power, and many are willing to go along with Henry's campaign against the Pope. Now, the immediate reason for Henry's initiation of the English Reformation, his rejection of the authority of the Pope, is his desire for a divorce, or strictly speaking, an annulment, that is to say, canceling his marriage with Catherine of Aragon. An annulment, as opposed to divorce, the Catholic Church wouldn't give divorces, does not give divorces, but the Catholic Church will say that perhaps a marriage never should have happened to begin with. Perhaps it was not, in fact, a valid marriage. So an annulment is basically recognizing that the marriage was not a marriage. And that is what Henry seeks to get from the Pope. And his failure to get that is what kicks off the English Reformation. Now, why did Henry want this annulment? Well, if you can think back to lesson 4, you will remember, there we go. You will remember the very end of lesson 4, we talked about how Henry VII of England, the first Tudor king, he ended the War of the Roses in 1485, this big civil war that had happened in England because of a dispute over the succession to the throne. He was a very shrewd ruler, and he sought to increase the power of the English monarchy, which was really a very second-rate power in Europe at that time, by allying it to the rapidly rising power of Spain. So he marries his oldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, Princess Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Now, unfortunately, Arthur dies very shortly after the marriage. So what to do? Well, Henry VII, shrewd as always, says, well, I've got another son, a strapping lad, Henry, future Henry VIII. He can marry Catherine instead. One small problem, according to church law, you cannot marry your deceased brother's wife. Why? Well, this is based on an interpretation, probably a misinterpretation, of Leviticus 20:21, which is, you should not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. Whoever does so shall be childless. The medieval church understood this as a prohibition against marrying your brother's widow. Well, so how to get around this? Well, straightforward enough. You ask the Pope for a dispensation. This is one of the great things about being Pope. One of the great things about having so many rules is the Pope could grant exceptions to the rules, particularly if you paid a nice little sum of money. So monarchs, powerful people, were very often able to get exceptions. Sure enough, Henry VII gets an exception from the Pope. Henry is allowed to marry Catherine of Aragon. And they lived happily ever after, right? No, unfortunately not. Things aren't very happy from the start. The problem is that Catherine seems to be having trouble having children. She has miscarriages. She has a few children that are born but that die very early in infancy. Finally, she has one daughter, Mary, who seems to be hanging in there, survives and grows into a young child. But a daughter, that's not great if you're a monarch in the 16th century, especially in England. The claim of a daughter to the throne is somewhat tenuous. It's much easier for a male heir to make a claim to the throne. And even if she has a technical claim, it's very easy in that violent world for a male contender to unseat her, and possibly leading to a civil war again, like you had seen in England just a few decades earlier. So Henry is very concerned to get a male heir. And Catherine does not seem to be producing one. Why not? Something wrong with Catherine? Well, it seems to be, Henry thinks, that it is in fact the curse of Leviticus 20:21 being visited upon him for this unlawful marriage, which he was never very comfortable about to begin with. So as we move on into the 1520s, and she still hasn't produced a male heir, Henry begins to consider that perhaps he needs out of this marriage. Perhaps he never should have been in this marriage to begin with. Perhaps it's not, in fact, a marriage. In fact, it's an affront to God. So he begins appealing to the Pope for an annulment. This becomes known as the King's Great Matter, the campaign for the king to get this annulment from the Pope. Now, he's particularly interested in this from 1526 or so onward, after he meets this fetching young lady, Anne Boleyn, who he becomes quite smitten with. He wants her to become his mistress. She won't go along with that, but she does hint that she would be willing to become his queen. So here's another incentive to get the annulment with Catherine of Aragon. He's got a good replacement lined up for her. And Anne Boleyn, he's confident, will be able to produce him a male heir. So, the first person in charge of the King's Great Matter is this guy, Thomas Wolsey, the Lord Chancellor of England, fantastically wealthy, ridiculously powerful guy, who Henry has basically elevated to be his chief minister. But Wolsey also has all kinds of powers from the Pope. He basically functions as the Pope's chief minister in England as well. So Wolsey is able to use his power in both church and state to amass a lot of wealth for himself, and he's broadly disliked throughout England, but he's very good at what he does. He's very efficient at getting the king's work done. So the king trusts him with all his most important tasks. Unfortunately, Wolsey is not able to deliver on the annulment. Wolsey cannot convince the Pope to grant the annulment to this marriage. Why not? Often, popes made exceptions allowing marriages. Popes made exceptions allowing people out of marriages. Wasn't that uncommon especially for very powerful people like King of England. If they wanted an annulment, they could often get one. Why could Henry not get one? Well, in this case, Catherine of Aragon happens to be the aunt of a very, very powerful person, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Charles V's armies have just recently sacked Rome, and he has the Pope very much at his mercy. So the Pope does not want to provoke Charles V anymore. Charles V leans on the Pope, says, "You better not grant this annulment." The Pope doesn't. So Henry initially blames Wolsey. This is all Wolsey's fault. Wolsey botched the negotiations. So Henry puts this guy, Thomas More, in charge as Lord Chancellor of England. One small problem: Sir Thomas More is devoutly loyal to the Pope. So once Henry begins to decide that, in fact, it is the Pope who is the problem, More is not a very reliable ally in getting Henry what he wants. In fact, More is much more interested in persecuting Protestants. You may remember our old friend, we mentioned him once at least, William Tyndale, who had begun to bring the word of God into England by translating. He was a Protestant in the 1520s who translated the Bible into English. And More was trying to chase down William Tyndale, trying to chase down his followers and anybody who was a follower of Luther in England. So at this early stage, things don't look promising for the Reformation at all. However, the power structure begins to shift. This fellow in particular begins to change things. This is Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer becomes a trusty servant of King Henry in the later 1520s and is sent all around Europe trying to negotiate the king's great matter, trying to get support from different rulers in Europe, different theologians. Cranmer's idea is if he can get lots of theologians to sign off on the statement sort of agreeing that Henry's marriage was bogus, that he never should have been married to Catherine, then they can present this to the Pope, and then the Pope will have to let him out. Well, this is a bit naive of Cranmer, but Cranmer does win Henry's trust. Also, he also has the trust of Anne Boleyn, which is important. And interestingly, importantly for our future narrative, while Cranmer is in Germany on this diplomatic business for the king, he meets Lutheran reformers, and he becomes increasingly enamored of Lutheran ideas. He begins to become, at least in some ways, a Protestant, up to the point where he secretly marries the niece of one of the Lutheran reformers, Andreas Osiander. Well, why is this a big deal? Well, remember, clergymen, Cranmer is a priest, clergymen are not supposed to marry at all. Protestants, of course, said, no, it's fine for a priest to marry. Luther himself had gotten married in 1524. Well, Cranmer, shortly after this, however, is summoned back to England and invited to become the new Archbishop of Canterbury, the most important churchman in England. Henry is looking to, at this point, considering rejecting papal authority, and he wants someone in the supreme, the highest church position in England who's on his side. So he nominates Cranmer. So here you have a guy who's secretly married, has to smuggle his wife back to England and pretend that she's a housemaid. And in fact, he keeps their marriage secret for many, many years because King Henry remains staunchly opposed to the idea of priests being married. Now, Cranmer is going to be in a position to begin to bring Protestant ideas into the Church of England. Now, the next important character, however, is this fellow, who in the near term is even more important, Thomas Cromwell. Now, it's a bit confusing. You've got Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. Well, Thomas Cromwell is a very skilled lawyer who had worked for Wolsey. And Cromwell, after things don't seem to be going very well with getting the annulment, Cromwell begins exploring the idea that perhaps the King of England should assert his authority as King of England and say the Pope does not have this authority here. The Pope is basically claiming a legal authority over a legal matter, and how could somebody outside of the Kingdom of England have legal authority over the King of England, right? The King of England has got to be the supreme legal authority in England. Well, it makes sense. The King and the Parliament. Excuse me. So Cromwell begins maneuvering in Parliament to get support for a series of laws that will reject the authority of the Pope in England and give that authority to the King, to Parliament, and to those whom the King appoints as leaders of the church within England. Now, the first important act, let's see here. Well, this is not the one yet, but so let me actually not go to that one yet. Let's stick with Cromwell here. So the first important act that is passed in Parliament is in 1532. Cromwell engineers some legislation called the Act in Restraint of Appeals. So the Act in Restraint of Appeals basically says precisely this. This is a legal appeal that is being at stake here. Henry wants to get annulment with Catherine of Aragon. Catherine is naturally going to appeal this decision to the Pope if he tries to do it. And why should the Pope be able to make a legal decision that is binding on England? So the Act in Restraint of Appeals says England is an independent nation. England makes laws for England, and nobody outside of England can say how the law in England is supposed to be enforced. So this passes Parliament with pretty wide support because Parliament has become increasingly frustrated at the Pope's meddling in English affairs, the fact that, you may remember the benefit of the clergy, the idea that clergymen were exempt from civil law. So Parliament wants to assert that indeed the law courts of England should be supreme over everyone in England. The next act, important act, is the Act in Restraint of Annates, which is payments that were made to Rome every year. That the new clergymen had to pay Rome a significant portion of their salaries, basically. So this is basically a tax that's being levied out of England going to the Pope. And this is, again, a key sticking point for many Englishmen, this idea that the wealth of England is being slowly drained away toward a distant Pope who doesn't have, so in some ways doesn't have England's best interests in mind. In fact, seems to be working against England's best interests. All of this then paves the way for the Act of Supremacy. That is, this is a copy of that from the Parliamentary Archives. Can't really read it here, right? But the Act of Supremacy says, see if I have the text here, albeit the King's Majesty justly and rightfully is and oweth to be the supreme head of the Church of England, and so is recognized by the clergy of this realm in their convocations. Yet nevertheless, for corroboration and confirmation thereof, and for increase of virtue in Christ's religion within this realm of England, and to repress and extirpate all errors, heresies, and other enormities and abuses heretofore used in the same, be it enacted by authority of this present Parliament, that the King, our sovereign Lord, his heirs and successors, kings of this realm, shall be taken, accepted, and reputed the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England, called Anglicana Ecclesia, and shall have and enjoy annexed and united to the imperial crown of this realm, as well the title and style thereof, as all honors, dignities, blah, 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 blah. And that our said sovereign Lord, his heirs and successors, kings of this realm, shall have full power and authority from time to time to visit, repress, redress, reform, order, correct, restrain, and amend all such errors, heresies, abuses, offenses, contempts, and enormities whatsoever they be, which by any manner spiritual authority or jurisdiction ought or may lawfully be reformed, and so on and so forth. Okay, it's a bunch of legalese rhetoric. But the important point is that now the supreme head of the Church in England is the Church of England is the King of England, not the Pope. In fact, this is the idea that there's a church of England, not just a church in England. This is a new development. For this time, there was the Church of Rome, which had a church in England, but the church in England was always just an outpost of the Church of Rome. Now the Church of England is an independent thing, an independent entity that orders its own affairs under the authority of the king and those whom he appoints. Now, in some ways, this is simply an extension of the principle that Luther had articulated in his letter to the Christian nobility of the German nation, in which Luther had said that lay people, lay leaders in the church, princes and town councilmen and kings and dukes, have a responsibility before God to take leadership in the reform of the church within their areas. So this idea, this text that I said that he shall visit, repress, redress, reform, order, correct, and restrain all such errors, heresies, etc. The king is claiming an authority under God to reform the church, which is what many Protestants have said. Most Protestants were not quite willing to go so far as to say the king was the head of the church, or they were a little uncomfortable with that rhetoric. Christ only is the head of the church. Kings may have certain responsibilities as governors, as leaders, as reformers of the church, perhaps. And indeed, Henry certainly has a more elevated idea of his own authority in the church than most of the reformers would be comfortable with. And, perhaps most problematically for a Protestant, Henry is not particularly interested in Protestantism. He was interested in getting independence from the Pope initially so that he could get permission to marry Anne Boleyn, which he, in due order in 1533, the Archbishop, the Act of Restraint of Appeals has been passed. So Henry goes to Thomas Cranmer, our Archbishop of Canterbury, and has Bishop Cranmer release him from the marriage. And now this is the final decision. It cannot be appealed outside of England. Now Cranmer marries Henry to Anne Boleyn. Soon Anne Boleyn becomes pregnant. Anne Boleyn gives birth to, well, another daughter. Not the son that Henry's looking for, but, you know, he can wait. Meanwhile, Cromwell is maneuvering to use his position to begin to enact some more significant reforms in England, because Cromwell is, in fact, a Protestant. He is quite convinced of Lutheran teaching, but he has to play it fairly carefully because Henry himself he doesn't trust the Pope. He thinks the Pope's claims are way over the top, but most of the other claims of medieval theology, Henry remains a devout Catholic, still believes in transubstantiation, still goes through all the same worships like a good Catholic. Okay. Now, so let's just talk about a few things in the remainder of the 1530s, and then we'll come back to Henry's reign and the rest of Henry's reign in a later lesson. Now, Anne Boleyn, turns out that marriage does not remain happy for very long, because she doesn't produce a son. She's perceived as scheming against Henry. There's a real falling out. Ultimately, she is tried for treason and beheaded. And his third wife is Jane Seymour. This marriage does produce a male heir, finally, the young Edward, who's going to play an important role in the English Reformation. Unfortunately, Jane dies in childbirth, and so Henry is now wifeless once again. In fact, he's going to end up going through, well, depending on how you count it, 2 or 3 more wives before the end of his reign. Now, this point, we're right now in 1537, and this marks the high point, really, of the Protestantism coming into the Church of England. Before this point, Henry has remained quite hostile to the Reformation. In fact, William Tyndale, in 1535, was captured and ultimately executed for heresy. Even though Thomas Cranmer didn't want that to happen, Henry still sees William Tyndale as a heretic. He's not going to have this Protestantism in England. Pope isn't the head of the church. Henry's the head of the church, but Henry is almost as intolerant of Protestantism as the Pope. However, Cromwell and Cranmer have been working on him. They're beginning to make some progress. And in 1530, later in the 1530s, we in fact have the publication of a Bible in English that is under the authority of the king. Tyndale had been wanting an English Bible. Tyndale was executed, but Tyndale's last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And he did indeed open his eyes, at least to the extent of authorizing an English translation of the Bible. This is the Great Bible of 1539. So, to that extent, Henry is going along with certain Reformation ideas. Also, in 1538, the most radical effect of the English Reformation so far is the dissolution of the monasteries. You may recall one of the key issues in the Reformation was the monks having this independent and privileged status. Well, in England, too, there was a great deal of bitterness against the monks, who were seen as, supposedly they were taking these vows of poverty, but in reality, many of the monasteries had tremendous wealth. and this wealth was just being wasted on these monks instead of actually being put to good use. So Henry begins by shutting down certain monasteries that are seen as basically not serving any useful purpose. They just have a bunch of land that they're wasting. But increasingly, he decides to go ahead and shut down all of the monasteries in England. The monastery doesn't trust them. Many of the monks are still loyal to the Pope rather than him, so that's one reason. He thinks they're wasteful, as many Englishmen do. And also, they got a lot of land and wealth, and he can always use that. And in fact, what ends up happening is that when the monasteries are shut down, most of the wealth of the monasteries is taken by Henry or given to various noblemen who supported him, because he had a lot of people that had really stuck their necks out to support him during the 1530s. Henry rewards them with the lands, the monasteries. And this is something for which Henry is often most hated, was the rather abrupt and violent way in which he shut down the monasteries in England and took all their wealth, and many of these beautiful buildings then subsequently fell into decay and collapsed. However, this feature of the English Reformation was really just a more sort of abrupt and sudden version of what was happening everywhere the Reformation took hold, which was monasteries were being shut down, monks were being sent out to get married, to live ordinary lives, and the wealth that had formerly belonged to monasteries was being redistributed and used for, at least ideally, for the benefit of society at large, although sometimes just for the benefit of powerful people. So here in 1538 and 1539, it looks like the Reformation is finally gaining some steam in England. We have the Bible being published in English, monasteries being gotten rid of, figures like Cromwell and Cranmer, who are indeed Protestant, their convictions have a great deal of influence, and foreign reformers are in constant correspondence with some of these leaders in England and are hoping to really bring Henry around to a full Protestant doctrine. Unfortunately, that does not happen. Henry was always a very capricious guy, changed his mind pretty readily, and he's going to veer back to his old ways in persecuting Protestants for the last few years of his reign. But we'll have to save that narrative for another lesson, and indeed, we're going to take a break from England and move back over to the continent to see what's happening in France and Switzerland in our next lesson. So I hope you'll join me next time at Davenant Academy. Thanks so much.